hand over now to Jo, if that's okay.
That's lovely. Thanks very much indeed, Rick. And Ruth, I'm not sure whether you got our one pager or not. If you did, that'd be great to share it on the screen. But if not, I can happily talk to it. I think, first of all, what is really helpful is that I think everything in the report we absolutely recognise, and indeed in terms of those recommendations, then we would completely support the direction and the spirit of those recommendations. So I just want to begin really by saying how important this is. We have 5 deaths a day on the roads, and we simply can't afford to continue to tolerate that. In no other area of policing would we have that, and there wouldn't be a significant drive, a critical incident declared, in order for us to be able to deal with some of this. So part of our strategy, which we're about to launch, is very much around making sure that we are policing our roads together to actually reduce those deaths and serious injuries on the road. So just a bit of background. So I'm the NPCC lead on roads policing, and I pride myself, both as a chief but also in relation to this particular subject, about making sure that whatever strategy we set within policing actually is deliverable on the ground and has a real relationship with what those officers at 2 o'clock in the morning who are pitching up at that very sad fatal collision can actually relate to. What is it that we're doing strategically that is actually going to be able to deliver and develop those things which will enable them to help us to save those lives? Because sometimes I think strategies don't always meet reality, and so I think it's important that they do. And I think in relation to that, we have to remember the human impact of collisions and serious injuries. And I think when it's written on paper, it's all too easy to read those words and not to really think about what that means. What does that mean when that family gets that knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning? What does it mean when that officer passes that death message? And what does it mean for that person who's seriously injured and actually has to live with the consequences of having been hit by a drunk or driver who's under the influence for the rest of their life? And of course, what's the cost to society of that to a certain extent as well? But the human cost has to be writ large in terms of what we're considering. So in the middle of our strategy, it's very much about that, policing our roads together, but then the top one, preventing harm and saving lives. How do we make sure that our collective consciousness every day is remembering what we're trying to achieve? I think the average cost of a fatal collision is just over £2 million per collision. That's a significant, a huge amount of money as well, set aside that personal cost. So we've got to continue to strengthen how we prevent harm and save lives. We've also got to remember the impact that that has on those emergency services workers, not just police, but fire, ambulance and others, and those members of the public who may witness it, in relation to the impact of them turning up and dealing with those KSIs as well. Because internally within policing, we are definitely seeing the impact in terms of that. So that's also important within the strategy. You'll see on the right hand side, we talk about tackling crime. And actually, this is about tackling the serious and organised crime. There are very, very few criminals who don't use the road network in order to further their crime, whether or not that is the county lines, whether or not it's the more organised, serious and organised crime, whether it's the theft of vehicles, whether it's the theft of highly valued farm machinery, whether it's actually transporting women and girls particularly who are being exploited for means. All of those people have to get to where they're going somehow, and they're using the roads in order to do so. So it's a really key part of our strategy to make sure that that tackling crime, which is also of course mentioned in the report, is writ large. And the other reason that's really important is because that's largely what chief constables are being held to account for under the policing measures. And what that does is to make sure that we are reminding every day my colleagues that it's not just about me continuing to try and influence the increase of resources into roads policing. It's actually that beyond that, road policing is that enabler in order to drive further prevention and detection of wider crime. And we're really pleased that Alan Pewsley, who's the Chief Constable in Kent, has sponsored, if you like, that tackling crime part of the strategy, because that's really important to have him and the Crime Coordination Committee on board to support that. And the other bit about tackling crime is that we mustn't just see it as that criminal, that acquisitive, that serious crime. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that whether it's death by dangerous driving, whether it's death by careless, whether or not it's an abnormal load, whatever the crime is, whatever the road crime is, we have to try and influence people's thinking that that is a crime. Speeding is a crime, because that can lead to far greater consequences. And I think it's really important that we try to change the language in terms of that road crime that we see every day. And of course, antisocial driving. I think it has been more visible, maybe more noticeable since the pandemic. We've certainly had an increase in terms of the number of reports of selfish, antisocial driving. And therefore, the sense of responsibility that people must feel when they get behind that wheel, in terms of the impatience that we're seeing, in terms of the poor driving, in terms of the fact that people think it's okay to go onto the roads without insurance, without a driving licence, etc., etc. We definitely need to tackle that. And then moving around, slightly conscious of time here, in terms of the driving technology and innovation, and it's Professor Paul Taylor, who is actually the scientific advisor to the Chiefs Council as a full-time role, who has sponsored this part of and supported this part of our strategy, because we must look to the future. We've got to be fully engaged with those lawmakers and visionaries to properly anticipate what that future use and what the future policing of our roads looks like. I'll give you an example. I was out on patrol a couple of mornings ago. I still go out regularly. I'm still an advanced driver and often go out with roads policing to make sure that I can get that triangulation of reality with strategy. And we were talking a lot about the anti-collision technology, which is built into many cars these days, many of the newer cars. And actually, the impact that that anti-collision technology could have on some of the tactics that we use to bring an incident to a safe conclusion, which could well be tactical contact with a vehicle, sometimes quite robustly and rightfully so. We need to think about how we adapt our tactics going forward to actually be able to absorb some of those developments within that space. And of course, also looking to the future around shared space, around obviously e-scooters have already been mentioned. My inbox as a chief, probably 20% of the emails I get into my inbox is people complaining about e-scooters and working out actually where do e-scooters fit. Of course they're electric, of course they could be very environmentally friendly, but we're increasingly seeing those collisions and those complaints, the antisocial driving of them, the criminal, the way in which they're enabling criminality, etc. So all of those challenges in terms of looking to the future we have to consider. And then around changing minds, and for me this is the most important one, and I know Dr. Helen Wells is on the call, going to be on the panel, and Helen's really makes me think. I think she's fantastic, I really do, and she really makes me think because she comes from it from a very independent, non-policing perspective, which is terribly important so that we're not navel gazing. And she is a member of the policing, our road policing board, and we talk a lot about how do we actually convince people who normally abide by the law, who would consider themselves to be legal, lawful, law-abiding citizens, but probably both break the law and complain about others breaking the law in the same breath when it comes to things like speeding. They probably do 34 miles an hour in a 30, but then probably also complain about that driver that's undertaken them on the dual carriageway. How do we change minds around that road behaviour? Because if you want me to change my behaviour, you've got to change my mind first. You've got to persuade me why I would want to actually do something differently. So for me, it's that influential, it's the persuasive part of this strategy, which I think is going to be the real driver towards Vision Zero, towards reducing those KSIs on the road. It's the enabler, it's the synovial fluid, I think, of this strategy. And I know Helen will talk far more eloquently, far more articulately than I can do around some of those behaviours on the road. And also, of course, linked to that is the education part of it. You know, UK Rower do, I think, a fabulous job, along with some other organisations, about influencing and changing behaviours on the driver awareness courses and some of the other courses that are run. How do we make sure that they're really fit for the future? How do we make sure that we're really impacting on some of those things that are going to become much more prevalent in the future alongside speeding? How do we, and I was talking to some parents the other evening who have got children of an age that are now learning to drive, and they're saying, but we want them to do the speed awareness course before they even go independently into a car. Because if you're saying to me that that is so influential around people slowing down, why wouldn't we actually offer that course to a provisional driver almost as part of, for example, them getting their licence? Why wouldn't that be almost something you have to do before you get your licence, is to attend a speed awareness course or a road safety course or whatever that might look like? So I think in terms of that changing mind bit, there's a huge amount that we can all do as leaders to influence what that looks like going forward and to shape it. That's incredibly important to me. Finally, just a couple of points I want to pick up on. We talk about roads policing officers. I think we need to be incredibly careful that we are not excluding many of the resources within policing who can have a significant impact on safety on our roads. And an example I would use is our police community support officers, who actually will go out around school time. They'll focus on those drivers who are parking on the zigzags or dropping children off and driving off at speed because they're late for their meetings or whatever that looks like. The family, and I've popped something in the slide bar, the family who I went to see a couple of weeks ago, you know, they'd lost their very young daughter. She was walking a very short distance from their house to the bus stop where she was being picked up, and she was killed. She was killed by a van driver who was in a hurry to do his deliveries, and she stepped slightly out from behind a car and he came along and he killed her. And it's incredibly sad and tragic and moving and very humbling to actually sit with that family and talk to them about it. But actually, the role of PCSOs in those kind of circumstances will have far more influence, one would argue, than a road policing officer, because of the preventative ability, that visibility within that kind of arena. And when you look at, for example, our enforcement units that most forces now have, we have a specialist enforcement unit in Sussex, and they're a unit who are absolutely designed to go out and catch the really bad people, relentlessly pursue those criminals who are going to bring harm to the communities that we are charged to serve. And they probably do more around taking dangerous drivers off the roads, because it's the powers under the Road Traffic Act and some of the other powers that give them far greater capacity and capability to be able to stop vehicles and take them off the road than some of the other things. So we really must think much more widely these days around which resources we're using to police our roads, and actually what type of policing, whether it's the preventative, whether it's the enforcement, whether it's the education, we want them to hone in on. So that's a key point for me. And I just want to finish on that centre one, and you'll see around the outside of that slide, it's really important that we do base this on evidence. It's important that we continue to drive a consistent way of recording, because at the moment, I mean, I took this portfolio over in July, and I think that there is some really good areas of recording, but I think it's patchy, frankly. And I think it's the same with most things in policing. If you ask a slightly different question, then you'll get a very different answer. So that consistency of recording what we're doing and then using that as an evidence base is going to be a key component going forward to make sure that we drive this efficiently, effectively and persuasively. Achieving that through the 4 E's, the 5 E's now is pretty self-explanatory on the bottom right hand side. And then the environmentally and economically informed. If we're not careful, we're going to have, I mean, I would call it blue on blue, wouldn't I? But we're going to have a really inelegant collision of discussions. E-scooters are a really good example, aren't they, where you've got the environmental argument that says they're great, particularly, you know, Brighton, which of course is within Sussex. You know, e-scooters are used hugely, and we have a great enforcement campaign, but there is an argument to say they are the most environmentally sound way to get around Brighton. Of course, they're not legal, and that's the point. So we've got to try and bring those discussions elegantly together into a simple and understandable message, I think, for users. And then the top left-hand box is really important. Ethically and procedurally sound. We must make sure that when we are developing what I hope we will continue to develop in the future, that actually we design out any unconscious bias, any procedural bias, any systemic bias that may be, whether it's age related, whether it's race related, whatever that is, we've got to be really clear that what we're doing is ethically and procedurally sound, particularly when it comes around to some of the emotive discussions around things like speed cameras. You know, and we have all seen the Daily Mail front page and all of the others talk about it's a cash cow, it's this, it's that, it's the other. Whatever we do around enforcement in the future, we've got to make sure that it is ethically sound and that we can describe exactly how the link to what we're doing there saves those lives. I'm going to finish because I'm acutely conscious of time, but I'm happy for any of you in other organisations to come and talk to you about this, you and your teams about this, and to present this strategy a bit more in full. The report says that we need serious leadership. You know, I sit here not just as a chief constable, but I sit here as a person who, when I was a teenager, my father was killed on the roads on his way to work one morning. So for the last 30 or whatever it is, longer than that, years, I and my family have lived with the consequences of somebody being killed on our roads. So I come to this portfolio, and I think part of the privilege of leading this portfolio is being able to bring that lived experience which should make sure that what we on this call and the leaders are doing is actually driving that reduction in the killed and serious injured, to make sure that families like mine don't continue to go through that pain. The report says that we need serious leadership. I would say we need serious, insistent, persuasive and relentless leadership, where our joint collaborative intent is brave enough to drive that real change, because for me, that's what will save lives. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks very much, Jo. Fantastic, and thank you for